Hello, I'm Hilary Harper. I present the Saturday morning program on 774 ABC Melbourne. This is very different from the gardening talkback, very exciting. I welcome and thank you for coming out on a pretty hairy day. I think you'll find it's worth it. I opened this book and I sometimes feel like it's a bit ominous when there are 5 pages of glowing testimonials about it. It's like someone's trying just a little bit too hard. But fortunately they are all true this time. Joy Fowler has written 6 novels, including the hugely successful The Jane Austen Book Club, which spent 13 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. We are all completely beside ourselves. Won the Penn Faulkner Award this year for fiction, which is judged by writers, so tough crowd. And it's on the long list for this year's Man Booker Prize, which I think is being announced overnight, sometime very soon. You'll be having a good sleep then tonight?
Oh, yes.
And Karen was also once fluent in the Lapine language from Watership Down. If we're really lucky, we might hear some of that tonight.
I may be a bit rusty.
I did not give her warning of that. Now, there will be time for questions afterwards, so if I miss anything or if there's something that you think of, hold on to it. We'll have a microphone that comes around, and Karen will be signing books afterwards too, so you can get your very own copy. Karen, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, I'm just going to assume that you've all read the book, okay? Good. Because I'm tempted to have my first question, what is wrong with us as a species? But perhaps we'll ease in. You made a very tough task for reviewers who wanted to avoid spoilers. Would you want people to come to the book clean?
I did. You know, I think if you have read the book or do read the book, it'll be quite clear that there are certain things I did not intend you to know until well into the book. Having said that, I really didn't think through what that would mean for the marketing department and for book reviewers, and until they all began to complain about it, and I was, mildly sorry, but until I suddenly realized that as I went out trying to promote the book, I also was going to have some problems, then suddenly I thought, what was I thinking?
There was one reviewer that was grumping away. I tried really hard to avoid the spoilers, but Karen didn't, so here goes. Just gave up. I love how you write how at one period in the 70s, raising chimps as part of the family was pretty normal in a particular part of the States. The supermarket aisles were full of these families. What was going on in people's minds? What was the context that made that seem like a reasonable thing to do?
I may have overstated a little how normal it was, but there was a particular psychologist in Oklahoma who not only worked at the university with chimps in his lab, but as far as I can tell, appears to have also had clients as a psychologist and to have prescribed chimpanzees for all sorts of mental issues that people were dealing with, which is, again, puzzling, as you say, a puzzling response.
So someone is struggling with a mental health issue and the chimp is then inserted into that situation?
Yes, and then your psychologist says, you know what I think you should do? I think you should home raise a chimpanzee. I do think, actually, it's terribly time-consuming and very stressful, and probably all of your other problems would sort of disappear as a consequence.
Until the time when it became clear that you may need to change that situation again.
Yes.
Well, that's what stood out. It sounds like people thought about the process only up to a certain point, and there was this massive failure to think about how it might turn out in the end.
I truly believe that in the 1970s, when most of this occurred, people really didn't understand that there would be a problem. That I think that the people who took chimps into their homes believed they were making a lifelong commitment and that the chimp would live with them as long as the chimp lived, which can be 50 years or so. So we know now that that cannot be made to work, that chimps are just too dangerous eventually. But I truly think they did not know it then, and so it's not quite the case that they didn't think it through, just that they didn't think it through with good data.
Or were they thinking, I'm sure we can deal with it at some point, we can tame the chimp, we can change the chimp?
Possibly that too. I think, that one of the issues certainly was what a chimp would look like, what its behavior would be if it had an entirely human upbringing. And yes, they may have thought that they would have an impact that they were not able to have.
Barbara Kingsolver wrote a review which was really great to read, when she was saying that at that time different strands of behavioural psychology were kind of battling it out using the chimp subject as their battleground. What was going on there, and I guess what were people believing at the time, and how far have we come since then?
Well, the studies that I looked at were almost all focused on language, and there was a great divide. The battle was over whether the fact that a chimpanzee could learn a number of hand signs constituted language or not. And people who lived closely with the chimpanzees felt often that it did, but the scientists, like the one in Oklahoma, felt that it did not. Did not write that language is more than just one symbol for one thing. That it's syntax, and it's the way one word inflects another, and many things that they did not see the chimps doing. One of the things that was quite amazing to me is if the ostensible subject was whether chimps, the ability of chimpanzees to communicate, how very long it took for anybody to think, if this is what we're interested in, maybe we should be looking at how they communicate with each other and not insisting that they must learn to communicate with us. The very earliest experiments, they tried to get the chimps to actually vocalize, to make the sounds of words, and the chimp's skeletal feature makes that impossible. That it's just something they're physically incapable of doing. So declaring them a failure for that is again short-sighted at best.
And I was wondering how much the book and the film Project NIM were an inspiration, because I remember seeing this documentary a few years ago and realising they were talking about those issues and saying, oh no, they don't communicate, even though they're using multiple signs in context with particular people and different according to different communication moments. No, it's not a language. How much did that influence you?
When I started doing the research for this book, I read all of the books I could find on the subject of home-raised chimps, and it really did seem to me that everybody who had ever been involved in an experiment where they brought a chimpanzee into the home had written a book about it afterwards. So the one about Nim Chimpsky is, I think, called Nim Chimpsky, the Chimp Who Would Be Human, and I certainly was one of the books that I read. I was deep into my own book by the time the documentary came out, so I cannot say that the documentary had an impact on my book, but the book on which the documentary was based certainly was part of my research.
That wasn't all of it, though, was it? Because the germ of the idea came before the research. How did you come to the story?
The idea was a gift from my daughter. My father, her grandfather, who died before she was born and therefore is kind of a mythical figure to her, he was a psychologist who ran rats through mazes and studied learning behaviors as a result. And we lived in Bloomington, Indiana at that time. We moved from Bloomington to California when I was 11 years old. This comment will have far less impact here than it does at home, but I am fond of saying that I would not be a writer today if I had not been forced at age 11 to move from the utopia of Bloomington, Indiana to the hellhole of Palo Alto, California. So I am not the sort of person who suffers in silence, and for the next 40 years, as I married a Californian and as both my children grew up in California, I pointed out from time to time how much happier we would all be if we only lived in Bloomington, Indiana. So for the millennial New Year, my daughter took me back to Bloomington. It was her first trip, and we walked around the campus, and I was talking about her grandfather and showing her where the rat lab was and just reminiscing about the good old days in the rat lab, and somehow told her about an experiment that another psychologist who worked at Indiana University for a long time had done, which was to home raise a chimpanzee simultaneously to bringing up his infant son. And my daughter said, "Wow, that really should be your next book. What would it be like to be that kid?" I don't have good ideas myself, but I know them when I hear them. It's also given me, one of the banes of a writer's existence is people asking where you get your ideas, and now I know. Now I have the answer. My daughter gives them to me.
I think anyone who's read the Jane Austen Book Club might dispute that you don't have good ideas of your own, but we'll let that pass. I love the bit when Rosemary's dad gives her tips on basically how to pass as a real girl at school, how to improve her social standing, how you act and how you physically relate to people. If it doesn't work, does that say more about Rosemary or about the father's skills as a psychologist or possibly a parent?
Well, that's a good question, I guess, that I think that the theory the father has is probably a good one, and that the problem is probably in the execution, but that expecting a 6-year-old or 7-year-old girl to execute these things well is probably also not smart. So blame to go around, I suspect.
I'm wondering, does history record how the little boy fared after being raised with this chimp for a while?
The little boy killed himself when he was 41 years old. So whether that's connected to the experiment or not is very hard to determine at this date. But I have had a communication since the book came out from his surviving sister, and she certainly feels that there's a connection between the experiment and his death.
Your feelings about science and psychology in particular, or not your feelings, the views that come out in the book are decidedly mixed, I think. There's a couple of great quotes. Psychologists answer questions that nice people wouldn't even think to ask, says a mother-in-law. And when humans are the subjects, it's mostly not science, says Rosemary. How useful do you think psychology is as a scientific tool?
This is a big question, and one, since my father was a psychologist, I have to tread very carefully as I answer it. I do think that that the psychology that I grew up with, my father was a stimulus response psychologist, which was he worked with B.F. Skinner, is probably the most famous name associated with behaviorism. And I think that my father was a very brilliant man, and I think that he had a lot of difficulty at the end of his life, and that some of it involved the fact that the kind of psychology to which he had given his heart in an attempt, because he was above all else a scientist, an attempt to make psychology more scientific in its methods. I think that whole field of endeavor sort of came up short, and that he lived long enough to realize that he had sort of spent his life at something that was not going to survive or continue to advance.
Well, and scientists who sit more towards the traditionally scientific end of the spectrum can be very nasty about things that they see as leaning more towards the humanities, can't they? I mean,
well, my father was certainly very impatient with Freudians were not allowed into the house. Jungians could come for dinner, but only if they did their own dishes.
Well, is science a problem, do you think? In the book, it's it's certainly part of the problem. Is the problem science, or is it the way we implement it?
I think it's more the way we implement it. I think that it is very hard for us to move beyond ourselves in any endeavor, not just science, but science is perhaps the place where we're trying most to remove ourselves from our perceptions and from the results that we get from a scientific experiment. But I do want to say also that I took a class while I was finishing the book. I just got very, very energized and caught up in the whole issue of animal cognition. And I took an animal theory class at the university in Santa Cruz where I live and was, mesmerized by it's a very fast-moving field with very startling results now. And I truly believe, or I sense, that we are at a moment when our attitudes towards the other animals that we share the planet with are changing and deepening, and science has certainly produced that as much as it has delayed it. That it has been part of the problem, but it has also been part of the solution.
And I guess if we reject science for the damage that it's done, how do we find a way to balance the necessary rationality with some other way of dealing with difference and dealing with animals and other species?
Yes, this is the problem, I think. Good. But, when my father worked with animals, the great sin was to anthropomorphize, to project human motivations or human emotions onto the animals that you were studying, was seen as something that would skew your results. But I feel now that refusing to anthropomorphize is not a neutral position from which to start, that it carries its own consequences and implications for the data, and it puts the burden on the animal to prove itself in every way. And I think that science has moved into this. I read a book rather recently called The Bonobo and the Atheist by France Duval. And France Duval is one of the premier primatologists in the U.S. And there are a number of wonderful things that he says in the book, but one of them was that human exceptionalism is something that survives now, in his opinion, in the arts and in literature, and that science has moved past that, and that the continuity of our Darwinian heritage should make it come as no surprise to us that it turns out it looks more and more like there is no really bright dividing line between humans and the other animals, but that we are on a continuum.
We're not at the top of the tree.
Well, we may be at the top of the tree, but it's the same tree.
Well, you talk in the book about the legal difficulty of classifying animals. They couldn't be classified as people, but the judges were really uncomfortable about classifying them as things. What might that third option be? As the book came out, there were at least 2 cases in New York State where a lawyer was arguing for personhood rights for chimpanzees. And there, I think, is where he would like the third option to be, so that it's not that they have the full range of human rights, but that they have the limited rights of at least personhood. So do you
he
think
did, of course, lose both cases. So they are still classified as things and as property.
It's a bizarre idea to me that the legal profession could be just behind science and still further ahead than the humanities in dealing with the species difference issues.
Well, as I said, he lost both cases, so I don't know that they are that far ahead. And there was an enormous suspicion, I think, that the lawyers involved in this particular case would take a favorable ruling and begin to extend it, and soon we would not be able to eat meat. He was being accused of trying to make it illegal to eat meat.
Yes, I can see that just swinging incredibly successfully in the United States.
Yes.
I'm wondering if Fern, the chimpanzee, represents the difference between animals and humans, or are you thinking more about difference in general and how we relate to it?
Again, and now I'm sort of answering the question you said we would ease up on, which was, what is wrong with us? Again, to quote from The Atheist and the Bonobo, what Frans de Waal says is that empathy has turned out to be a natural trait, that all of the great apes evidence it, that we see it in many other species besides just ourselves. And so the good news part of that is that our morality is not something that has to be imposed from without, but is in fact part of our Darwinian heritage and natural to us. The bad news is that we seem to limit this empathy only to creatures that we see as like ourselves. And for anybody that we see as other, we not only are we not empathetic, we have what he calls an empathy deficit, an actual antipathy towards creatures that we see as other than ourselves. Which explains why whenever we go to war, one of the first things that has to be done is to persuade us that the people we're fighting are not like us. And perhaps also explains why persuading us of that generally turns out to be pretty easy to do.
And often the posters used to make people look very animalistic, the gorilla-like enemy.
Yes. So I have now forgotten the original question, but I assume I have answered it beautifully.
I think so. Yeah. Well, I guess that leads on to the question of the uncanny valley phenomenon, which you talk about in the book. Can you explain, or recap for us what that is, and why we get so uncomfortable when beings aren't quite different enough from us?
The uncanny valley is a hypothesis, unproven, I should say, but the suggestion is that if you think about cartoon faces or stuffed animal faces, or if they don't look very much like humans, they're often quite cute. And if they look exactly like humans, we're comfortable with that as well. But that there's some valley in between where they look a lot like humans, but not enough like humans, and that's where we're uncomfortable. That's where we dislike them, and for many people, I think chimps do fall into that uncanny valley.
And what is the theory there for what's going on in us? We're going, oh, that's just wrong.
I have no idea what the theory is. The theory is that we are uncomfortable. I don't know that anyone has proposed an explanation.
That's another one of those scientific watch this spaces.
Yes.
Fascinating. Well, let's talk about Rosemary, because the book is as much about her as it is about Fern. There's something very seductive for me about Rosemary's animal nature, that urge to bite people when they talk about the Socratic principle or jumping on the tables. Was she fun to write?
She was fun to write. There were some things when I made her up that came quite easily, and then some things that were very difficult to imagine, because I figured, again, based on the original experiment, one of the findings was that early for the first, and the original experiment that the book is loosely based on, lasted about 19 months, I think. And that up until about 16 months, the infant chimp outstripped the infant child in every possible way, just better at everything. And at 16 months, the human child begins to come into his own a bit, and then also to begin to surpass the chimp, particularly in the area of language. So when I conceived of Rosemary, first of all, I wanted the experiment to last much longer. I made the experiment in my book last 5 years because I really wanted Rosemary to have some memory of it. And I figured if you had a sister who was better than you at just about everything, you would really focus on that area that you were better than. So Rosemary sees her language skills as valuable, imagines that the people around her see them as valuable, And one of the really fun parts of writing Rosemary is the typical writing advice is that you should never use a $100 word where a $1 word will do. And it was wonderful to kind of throw all of that out the window and think, no, my character will always go for the $100 word. The part that was really hard to imagine, and I'm not sure the extent to which I, in fact, succeeded, because I'm not sure to the extent in which it's possible to succeed, is one of the things that we didn't know when the original experiment took place, is that the human infant brain is very malleable, very elastic, and that the brains that surround an infant have an impact on the development of that brain, an actual geographic impact, so that Rosemary, who spent so much of her early years in the company of her sister the chimp, her brain would actually not be quite a normal human brain. It would have taken on certain things because of spending so much time with Fern, and as I said, to the extent what exactly that would look like to have a brain that's not quite human, is something that may have been a bridge too far for me to make it up, but I did my best.
Well, it's certainly the schoolyard interactions make that very clear.
Well, yes, that was my thinking, that even if I couldn't articulate exactly what the difference would be, that children would be aware of it and there would be a response to it when she went out into the world.
The Boschian landscapes of middle school just sent a shiver down my spine, that quote.
Yes.
I'm wondering...
Not a period I would go back to in my own life.
It's so good to be older.
Even without my chimp brain.
I'm wondering if chimps have more in common with children than adults do with children. Certainly Rosemary, yes, but do you feel that's something you could expand on?
I think, I think it's easy to think that, and I'm not sure that it's not the case, but since the chimps, since the adult chimps have to be removed from human society, the chimps that we see the most often, the chimps that we see on television, the chimps that were home raised, were young chimps, and they certainly had more in common with children than with adults. I don't know that we know all that much about the older chimps.
Is that partly because we're just attracted to young, cute things of any species anyway?
Yes, absolutely. And chimps, when they grow up, become, very stolid and far less cute. Unlike humans, who just get better looking every day.
Well, there's wonderful moments with Rosemary too, where she is extremely clear-eyed in the way that children, even children who haven't been raised with chimps, are about what's going on in their families. And I love the bit where you explain, or she explains, that delicate balance of who is whose favourite within the family, who loves who more. She's very clear about it. When it's just her left, how does that affect that equation that families are?
Repeat the question. I just missed a little bit of it.
I
heard the setup. The actual question I missed.
When everyone else is gone, Fern is gone and Lowell is gone.
She's the only one left.
How does she cope with the family story then? Because everyone is missing that was that balance in the equation.
Well, it's it is the tragedy of the book that in many ways everyone in the family is destroyed when Fern is removed from the family, and I think that Rosemary, as the only one left, feels burdened by that fact, knows that her parents cannot possibly lose one more child, and yet feels that she is carrying some weight that her siblings should also be carrying. So, and also I think there is probably inevitably a sense that the child who remains, kind of by definition, can never be the favorite child, that the favorite child will always be the one who's missing and missed and desperately needed. And I know certainly seen many examples of this in my life, of the dutiful child who stays at home and takes care of the parents as they get older and older, and often feels unappreciated, as opposed to the party that is thrown when the sibling who is doing far less of the work suddenly deigns to show up.
Well, and Lowell and Fern really represent those two strands, don't they? Because Fern, you say quite explicitly, she talks about how it's her job to be okay when everyone else is gone, whereas Lowell sees his mission in life as something quite different, and that's both springs from that defining moment where Fern is removed.
Yes, exactly.
And Lowell and Fern, were you drawing on your research into what happened with people left behind when chimps were removed from families for those two different strands?
When I did the research for the book, as I said, there were a startling number of books written about these experiments in which chimps were home raised. The only one I'm aware of where there was an infant child is the original one. But a lot of the other experiments did have older children in the house when the young chimp arrived. And so I could actually find out a great deal about the experiments and about the chimps and about the results of the experiments, but there was nothing about the children, absolutely nothing. So no, I had to make the human characters up. I tried not to make the chimp character up so much. Everything that Fern does is something that some chimp was reported as doing in one of the books that I read, because I felt that I didn't have the background. I wasn't confident enough to imagine what a chimp might be capable of. But I know a lot about humans. I felt no such compunction in making the humans up.
Did you go and visit chimps? Did you spend time with chimps in facilities?
I had one day that I got to spend with some chimps. There's a facility. There used to be a facility in Ellensburg, Washington, and there were 3 chimps in residence when I visited. They were the facility was built for Washoe, who was one of the most famous of the home-raised chimps and the first chimp to learn American Sign Language, and also appears to have been a bit of a genius, because I'm not aware of another chimp who has managed the number of signs that Washoe learned. One of the interesting experiments that they did in the Ellensburg facility, which I think was built primarily to give Washoe a reasonably happy place to live, is that they did not teach the other chimps sign language. They wanted to see if Washoe would teach them sign language, which she did. None of them had the vocabulary that she had, but they all picked up some signs from her. She died a few years before I went there. So the 3 chimps who were left were the ones that had lived with her. And the facility used to put on what they called a chimposium, which meant that for a fee which went to the upkeep of the facility, you could go and spend a day with the chimps. And there would be lectures about the chimps, and you would see movies of the chimps, and you would also get to go see the chimps with a bulletproof glass wall between you and them. But it was quite wonderful, and we were told, since this is in fact where the chimps live, and we were guests in the house, that it would be up to the chimps if we were allowed to stay or not. And so we were carefully prepped on polite chimp behavior before being led into the area of the facility where we could see the chimps and the chimps could see us. And so we were told that we were not to stand upright, that was a threatening posture. We're supposed to hunch over and make ourselves look small and safe.
How did people cope with that?
Well, hunching over is just the beginning. We could not smile at them. If you show your teeth, that's also kind of a threatening behavior. And chimps themselves, you probably have seen pictures of chimps with grins just as wide as their faces. To humans, it looks like that's a very, very happy face. It actually means that they're terrified. And so we also were given facial expressions that we could and could not do. So when we all trooped in, first of all, you have to picture us all hunched over, and secondly, you have to picture us looking something like this. And we were taught to sign that we loved them. So we walk in, we've got our chimp face, we've got our chimp posture, and we're signing madly that we love them in the hopes that they will allow us to stay, which they did.
If I was a chimp, that would just be bizarre. All these people coming and going, I love you. Get away from me. Rosemary says that her first experience of death coming to a beloved character is an animal character in Charlotte's Web, and that you've written that was the case for you too. How does it change things if that beloved character is an animal and not a human, as happens in some of the other books that you mention in the book?
I think when you're a child, you make little to no distinction between a character being human and a character being an animal. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about when I wrote the book was the sort of insane territory we ask children to navigate, which is, and I've got grandchildren now, so I'm once again reading these books aloud. I would say 80 to 90% of the books that I read my grandsons have animal characters, but they're not really animals. They're animals who wear pajamas and brush their teeth and kiss their mothers goodnight. And so I feel that we actually encourage our children very, very strongly to identify with animals from day one. We fill their little cribs with stuffed animals, and then at a certain point we have to break the news to them that they've been eating these creatures as well, which I think can come as a terrible shock.
My toddler is negotiating the territory at the moment that the word for chicken is the same as the word for chicken on the plate, and it is really confusing.
It is really confusing because you think, I can't possibly be eating those creatures I just saw in Chicken Run who want so badly not to be eaten.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if there's any way to make children's experience of animals not confusing, or is it the fact that we are in denial about it that is the issue?
Somehow I feel that we've gotten, somehow we have settled into a place where caring a lot about animals is seen as a childish thing. And something that you move past, you get less sentimental about them as you grow up, and that it's appropriate that you do so. I'm not sure what the well springs of that are.
I was thinking about, you're saying lots of animal characters in books for small kids, but then when you get to things like 1984, the animals are bad, it's a darker purpose going on.
Some of them are bad.
That's true.
Some of them are not.
Well, I did a class on writing for children once, and they said, animals are a way for children to distance themselves from scary concepts and difficult narrative structures. It's like, how does that work if the animals are dressed and brushing their teeth? They are people to all intents and purposes for the child. Do you think that works?
No, I don't think that works.
Yeah, it's Hilary 1, class 0. I love the moments where Rosemary and other people are talking about the pop culture moments in the book. Rosemary talks about Star Wars and how upset she was that Chewbacca didn't get a medal. There's references to Lord of the Rings and Bridge to Terabithia, which is one of my favourite kids' books of all time. How did you get those elements so right?
I'm thrilled to hear that I got them right. The characters in the book, Rosemary, my main character in the book, is the same age as my children, so I just cast my mind back to the Star Wars years. I have an editor who does not, as far as I can tell, does nothing but read books. As far as I can tell, she has never watched a television show, possibly never seen a movie. She is always bewildered by the references to popular culture in my book, although she has quieted over the years since it's clear that I'm not going to stop doing it. But she did. There were some caustic enough with the Star Wars comments in the margins when I turned it in. My favorite story about her is that my second novel. I made a reference to a popular band in the 1960s, Four Lads from Liverpool, and she wrote in the margin of my manuscript, "You must not expect that everyone will have your arcane knowledge of music."
Well, I don't think there's any problem here. In the Jane Austen Book Club, you write that the quote is, "You might change, your reading might change, but the book remains whatever it had always been." So it's somehow set. And when I read that, I felt postmodernists across the globe just draw their breath in with shock. can you actually pin down a meaning like that? Because it does sound like a writer's fantasy rather than a reader's experience, that.
Gosh, am I going to be asked to argue about postmodernism? A subject on which I have to say I know almost nothing.
They rely on that, you know.
Having not taken literature classes. Certainly, I guess I have acknowledged that the reading experience changes dramatically. Is that not enough?
No,
will the postmodernists not be satisfied with that?
Well, I'm wondering, though, is the meaning of we are all completely beside ourselves permanent for you, or has it changed even in the time between starting writing it and now?
My intentions for the book changed in many ways, but I don't know. You know, for me, as the writer, when I turn a book in and I finish the edits and somebody puts a cover on it and it goes out, I don't read it again. So, and I don't think about it all that much again.
Till the publicity tour hits and you have to?
Well, maybe I should have said when the publicity tour is over. I don't think of it again. So, and partly that's a fear, mechanism, I think. If I pick up one of my early novels, how likely am I to be pleased? Best not to look, I think.
So you don't wonder how Jocelyn and Greg are going or what Rosemary's up to these days?
I figure they're on their own now.
You've set them free into the world.
Yes.
Well, let's finish up with a quote from the Times review. They said, "Prepare to be charmed and traumatised." Was that your intention?
I knew that I would be dealing with some very difficult material. I knew I would be dealing with some things that make me very unhappy, and I expected they would make readers very unhappy too. I think that my strongest moral position vis-a-vis this book and the world in general is that that if we can't bear to look at something, we shouldn't be doing it. And I extend that past our treatment of animals into the way we wage our wars, into the way we run our prisons. I think there are too many things that continue because we have managed not to look at them. And I knew that this book was going to ask people to look at some of those things. So I do apologize, but it is the point that I wanted to make. And I did try very, very hard as a sweetener to make the book also quite funny. So yes, I guess I did intend to charm and traumatize.
Does Rosemary eat meat?
Yes, but Lowell does not.
I think we'll finish there. Thank you, Karen. And we do have time for questions. We've got 2 microphones, so just pop your hand up and they will find you.
Thank you for your wonderful book. I loved it.
Thank you
very much. I really loved the idea that Rosemary ended up being a kindergarten teacher at the end of the book. And you describe she describes the wonderful time she has with these preschoolers and how they jump on tables and, touch each other and I think I'm right in saying, each other's hair and do all sorts of very physical things which are rather reminiscent of the types of things that Rosemary did with Fern as a child. Do you think, or were you commenting there on the fact that that children are in some way oppressed and that over-civilised, and if they were given half a chance they would behave more like chimps?
I did grow up in the 1950s in the Midwest, and I did have a kind of childhood which seems quite wonderful to me looking back. I'm sure I've got rose-colored glasses, but it's certainly not a kind of childhood that my grandchildren can duplicate. And we did have just enormous freedom. It was a kind of childhood where your mother just sort of opened the door in the morning and told you to come back at dinner time, and nobody had a clue what you were doing. As a parent myself, I guess I did not have the confidence that everything would be all right to quite reproduce that. So my own children, I think, had a childhood somewhere in between what I had and what my grandchildren have. But my grandchildren are really watched every minute and do not appear unhappy about that. But to me, it does seem like a great loss. And I do think that, that it was very clear to me as a parent when my children went to kindergarten that part of the project of kindergarten was to sort of bring them under control, to make it possible for them to be taught as a group by demanding certain sorts of behavior, which had not been demanded before, and which was kind of sad to watch happen. I don't have an alternative to either way. I'm sure if I were a parent now, I would also not be opening the door and allowing my children to go play with the cars or whatever they might do. But it does seem a great loss to me that they don't have that liberty.
Could you just talk about I've also read the book and thought it was wonderful, the title and then the structure of the book, the going backwards and forwards, and was it because you felt people would be confronted by the subject matter that you wanted to delay really telling the crux of the story, what it was about?
The title first. I truly do not remember how or when I thought of the title. I know that there was a long period where the book didn't have a title, and I was referring to it as my chimp book to people. And then the next thing I remember, it had a title, and this was it. When I began to tell my friends, as I'm in a couple of writing groups, and so I began to share what I thought the title of the book would be. I would say there was about a 50-50 split between people who thought it was really a wonderful title and people who thought it was just, they would respond by saying, "Oh." But I think that the people who disliked the title comforted themselves that surely by the time it went to my publishing house, I would be prevented from putting such a title on the book. And one of the great shocks to me is that nobody at my publishing house ever said a word about it. Nobody suggested. It wasn't even a discussion. What I like in a title is a title that has one meaning when you first see it and you haven't yet read the book, but means something different when you finish the book. So I hope that's what I intend this title to accomplish. In terms of the structure, I always knew that I wanted to delay the information that Fern was a chimpanzee for exactly the reasons that Rosemary gives. Where I started with the book was from reading the accounts of these home-raised chimps and how much the people who had participated in them felt that the chimps were just like children, except that they couldn't speak. They were just like children. And I wanted the reader to feel that, and I felt if the reader knew instantly that we were dealing with a chimp, that would skew away from the reaction that I wanted and the point that I wanted. So starting in the middle was part of the original plan. I always knew I would have to do that. And I think that I have more of a sense of competence when I'm writing short stories than when I'm writing novels. So I'm happiest if I can break the novel into pieces and have a structure to proceed with. And so for this one, the structure I had in mind, which didn't entirely turn out to be the structure, but close enough, was knowing that I was now starting in the middle. I thought, well, then the next section will be the beginning of the middle, and then I will do the end of the middle, and then I will do the end of the beginning, and then I will do the beginning of the end, and then I will do the beginning, and then I will do the end. And and it turned out to be somewhat less complicated than that. But it's like Dumbo's feather, that it just, if I believe I have a plan, it doesn't really matter if in fact I have a plan or not. I'm happier. I just feel happier.
Obviously, Fern being a chimp is central to the novel, but for me, one of the most gut-wrenching and powerful parts and effects it had on me was the way you grappled with tragedy and loss cleaving a family. So I'm interested if you can talk about that a bit.
Again, if you allow me my premise, which is that losing Fern would be very much like losing a child, then it seemed to me the damage would be devastating. I also thought that it was maybe not a coincidence that when I went to look at the books about the home-raised chimps, they all stopped before the moment when the chimp leaves the family, and possibly not a coincidence that I could not find information about the families and about the children. I wanted to write a book in which the damage was severe, because it seemed to me it would be. But I also wanted to write a book in which, in the way I conceived of the family, everyone in it was well-intentioned, that, it wasn't a lack of love. It was certainly a misguided experiment to begin with, but I wanted a family in which everybody had done the very best they could to take care of each other, and yet the damage was still something that they could not quite overcome. I think in many ways, the person in the book who carries the damage the most is the brother Lowell, and to me he's the most tragic figure in the book.
Thank you. Just picking up on what a previous person said about the title, to me it sounded as zany as the family in its dysfunctionality. I wondered about the reconciliation. I saw it as a reconciliation between Rosemary and the mother at the end, that they can actually come together and find some common ground. Because in the beginning it just seems, and I think at one point Rosemary says how everything she said irritated her mother so much, and this seems to be a gentle way of providing some resolution. If that's a reader response, I don't know whether you have anything to say about their relationship.
No, I think intriguing. That's exactly as I intended. I have had multiple people tell me that they cried all through the ending, and I did, in my defense, give the book the happiest ending I could possibly believe in. I could have made it a lot worse, but I did not.
I love that bit where Rosemary says, I had always intended to forgive my father. There is that goodwill, and it was just so sad that the time was not there, but you even put in that bit where you let her take on something from him at the end. So,
yeah.
I believe you. We've got time for a couple more questions. We've got 5 more minutes.
Excuse the indulgence for a second question, but I was just struck by, the most powerful scene for me in the book was where Lowell breaks into the facility where Fern is being kept, and that was obviously intended to be extremely confronting and emotional. I just couldn't quite get over the gratuitous misery of it. And you mentioned later that the guy running the facility was a bit of a villain, and that many of them were. Was it really as dreadful as that? Does science need to be quite as sort of dreadful and sadistic as that seemed to be? I just found it so hard to deal with, I guess. Yeah.
Certainly science doesn't need to be that sadistic, but the scientist that I had in mind, which is the man I referenced earlier, the guy from Oklahoma who prescribed chimps to his patients, at least according to the books that I read, really seems to me to live in infamy. Something that I included in the book which came out of the stories from the home-raised chimps, is that he would walk through the cages and he would force the chimps to kiss his ring, and there would be terrible consequences for them if they didn't. So at least in his case, yes, he seems to have been quite a supervillain. Belonged in a, as all supervillains do, in a, place for the criminally insane. And yet instead he was a psychologist treating other people.
I'm just wondering whether, how has writing and researching for this book changed your perceptions upon animals? Like, did you start from a kind of mindset where you were quite interested in animal rights, or has that developed? Did you kind of get more open to that when you wrote the book?
I have always cared a lot about how we treat animals. And I've always been concerned about animal rights. But I did undergo, I think, quite a large change as I was writing the book. When I had the original idea, I was very struck by an image, again, which is included in the book and which seems to have been included in most of the books that I read on the home-raised chimps, that if you hand them a stack of photographs of chimps and humans and ask them to sort them into piles, human and chimp, that they will only make the one mistake of putting their own picture in with the humans. And that just struck me as terribly sad and terribly unjust. And when I started writing the book, I felt a lot of empathy, a lot of concern over the chimps because of how human-like they were. And as I continued to research, and particularly as my research began sort of to broaden into other species, and as I took the class on animal theory, I just got a little ashamed of that original impulse that again, in the way France Duval claimed I would, my empathy seemed to be strongest if I could see a creature as being like myself. And I started thinking, why is that the criterion? There are lots and lots of animals who are capable of amazing things in terms of their cognitive abilities, but their capabilities are less human-looking. And so it's less easy for us to see it as intelligence because it doesn't resemble human intelligence in the same way. But I got more and more interested in these more alien kinds of intelligence, and also to think that it was a great shortcoming on my part to have started thinking if an animal can prove itself to be human-like, then I will agree that it needs special attention as opposed to an animal that is not very human-like.
I'm going to squeeze in one final question from over here.
Yes, your book concentrates on the way chimps interact with humans rather than other chimps, and I'm just wondering if at the time that those experiments were taking place in the 50s and 60s, we had Jane Goodall studying chimps in their natural environment. Did you take any inspiration from her work?
I did. I had an interesting research process, very different from any other novel I've written, where I usually start with a kind of very wide net as I'm looking for a story, and I know when it's going to take place, I know where it's going to take place, so I have some information, and I read pretty widely to see what I might find and what I might be able to make a story out of. In this one, I started pretty focused because I knew I was writing about this experiment and about the home-raised chimps, and the further I got, the wider my research got. So I went from the home-raised chimps, and the next thing I looked at was the research on chimps in the wild. And then from there, I went sort of into animal cognition in general, lots of things that were not pertinent to the book and were not included to the book. I just got too interested to turn away. So the experience of the wild chimps and the sorts of observations that people like Jane Goodall were making, were enormously interesting to me, but less relevant to the book I was writing. Didn't stop me from reading about them. They were amazing.
We'll have to wind up there, but thank you so much, Karen Joy
Well, thank
Fowler.
you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.